As the week ends, and week which, as we'll discuss shortly, even the US media is now openly saying has been terrible for Ukraine, the situation for Ukraine continues to get worse. Earlier today, I saw a report on Slavyangrad. Slavyangrad itself is saying, be careful about this. It might not be entirely accurate, but there was a report from Slavyangrad that some sections of the Ukrainian military are apparently giving out warnings that if President Zelensky and his officials make any overt moves to dismiss General Zelensky, well, in that case, the military itself will take action of its own to redress the situation in Kiev. In other words, an open threat of a coup d'etat. Now, a couple of days ago, in a comment, a piece of information which I think I missed discussing, the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umarov, actually was obliged to come out and issue a denial of rumors which had been circulating on that particular day that Zelensky was indeed about to be dismissed. It needs to be said very clearly that a situation in which the civilian president is unable to dismiss the country's senior military commander because he feels that if he does, the senior military commander might lead a coup against him, in which the senior military commander might be backed or would be backed by the bulk of the armed forces, and one in which that military commander, according to earlier reports from Ukraine, is refusing to resign despite a direct request that he do so from the president himself. Well, that country is already going through what is in effect a slow-motion coup. As things stand, Zelensky remains the constitutional president. He is still the person that foreign governments maintain contacts with. He is the person who travels abroad and who shows increasing reluctance to return. But General Zelensky is still there, despite the growing rift between the two men. And one gets the sense that the only reason why President Zelensky is still there and why General Zelensky himself cannot make a move is because Zelensky also understands that if he acted against Zelensky, that would trigger a political crisis. It might lead to a collapse within Ukraine, a collapse of legitimacy within Ukraine, and it might not be appreciated or supported by Ukraine's sponsors. I've said that in Greece, we call this kind of situation stasis, a situation of political deadlock. The Russians, perhaps rather more accurately, call it a situation of dual power. There are two power blocks, each in confrontation with each other, each powerful enough to resist the other, but neither able to overcome the resistance of the opponent. Two power blocks which between them have basically divided power between each other, and to the extent that these two power blocks are competitive, that obviously creates massive stalemate and dysfunction. So the political crisis in Kiev continues. We have open signs of unrest within the armed forces. It could be that this report, as Slavyangrad itself says, is phony. It might, for all I know, have been invented by the Russians. But it's striking that denials, when they do come from Kiev in response to things like this, sound more and more unconvincing by the day, suggesting that this crisis between the civilians and the military is indeed growing. And what, of course, is driving this are two factors. Firstly, the situation on the front lines, and secondly, the crisis with Western funding. Now, let me deal first with the second, the situation with Western funding. And we've had a whole succession of comments and observations about this from Western media, from Western newspapers. And let's start with the Financial Times. It has an article up today, Vladimir Zelensky's bitter week of disappointment. Ukrainian leader fails to secure long-term financial aid from US and EU. And it goes on to say that Zelensky began this week hopeful that his two biggest allies, in the face of Russia's invasion, would finally approve financial aid packages worth a total of $115 billion. He ended it with little to show for it. Fraying support for Kiev in Washington and Brussels coincided with Russian President Vladimir Putin vowing to attack Ukraine until his goals of denazifying and demilitarizing the country were achieved. Congress on Wednesday again failed to approve a $60 billion support package. 2 days later, a summit of EU leaders ended without agreement on their own €50 billion four-year funding for Ukraine. And a Western diplomat is then quoted as saying this was the moment for the EU leaders to take the stage, and they missed their mark. And we're then told that Ukraine's offensive has failed to free significant swathes of land from Russian occupation. Again, notice the extraordinary lengths to which Western commentators still go rather than admit the simple fact that the offensive has failed. And it goes on to say that Kiev's firepower is running low, just as Moscow is renewing its aerial attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, and that as fresh pledges of significant new aid have dried up in recent months, Kiev may have to revert to printing money, endangering economic and financial stability. Ukraine has liquidity through January, but it gets a little tight after that. We need to move quickly, said an EU official. Ukraine is right to be nervous. It's not a comfortable situation at all. We're then told that the EU will, of course, meet next month, and eventually perhaps some kind of aid package will be agreed. And we're also told that the Senate is indeed going to meet next week to try to reach some sort of an agreement. But we're told, in fact, the Financial Times says that it's unlikely that the Senate will be able to forge an agreement next week. The differences between Republicans and Democrats loom altogether too wide. And we have an even more panicky article, if I can say that, in CNN. And CNN is telling us that the situation in Ukraine is indeed getting bad. And in fact, we've had two articles in CNN, one about the lack of financial aid, the other about the catastrophic situation on the battlefield. And the one about financial aid starts like this. Ukraine has had a terrible week. Notice the word terrible week. The Financial Times talks about a week of bitter disappointment. CNN goes a bit further. Blame the US and the EU. And it's by Nick Patton Walsh. And we're told Ukraine is developing a drowning, not waving problem. It is struggling to say how badly the war is going. Giving a candid public assessment of how poorly a conflict is going can be unwise, as it can result in morale and support draining. But then it goes on to say that as Obama boosted troops in Afghanistan, public support declined over the years, in part because of a lack of realism about how the war was going. So on the one hand, telling the truth will lower morale. On the other hand, lying about how bad the situation is in time will lower morale also. And that does seem to be something of a Hobson's choice, I have to say. But I mean, I still think that it's better in a war, especially when dealing with one's external funders, to be straightforward and honest with them. But anyway, the article then does go on to say that the most useful headline for Kiev should be how unutterably bleak the front lines are from now. In every direction, the news is grim. Russian forces are hiving off parts of the eastern city of Avdeyevka, yet another town Moscow seems content to throw thousands of lives at, despite its minimal importance. Remember, I've said in many programs that even as it became increasingly clear that Avdeyevka would fall, this town, Avdeyevka, which sections of the Western media have repeatedly told us is of tremendous strategic significance, would be relegated to a place of minimal importance. Well, now you have the first article that says that, and sure enough, it's in CNN. So the Russians are hiving off parts of the eastern city of Avdiivka, even though, of course, it's only a place of minimal importance. Along the Zaporozhye front line, where the counteroffensive was focused but ultimately slow and unrewarding, another nice way of papering over a defeat. It wasn't a defeat, just that it was slow and unrewarding. Anyway, Russian units have come back with renewed vigor, and the defense is costly for Ukraine. It's true. The Russians are on the attack in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area and of the Vremivka salient area, and they seem to be close to reoccupying Rabotino itself, and they've pushed the Ukrainians well away from Verbovoye, and they're attacking other places around there. And by the way, I understand that some time ago they reoccupied Pyatikhatki, or most of it, and on the Vremivka salient, well, we've had less news recently, but the last I heard, which admittedly was some days ago, the Russians were gradually pushing towards Staromayorsk and Orozhanye, the two villages Ukraine claimed to have captured in August, to great fanfare, and which it looks increasingly likely is going to be lost. And then we're told that Ukraine has made, this is CNN again, a plucky or foolhardy dash across the Dnieper River with some small progress into Russian lines. The casualties have been immense. Their supply lines are problematic and their prospects grim. Well, as I discussed yesterday, Putin discussed the Krynky bridgehead, which is clearly what's being referred to here, and made it fairly clear that it was essentially a fire sack. And then we go on to read that Zelensky has had a truly abysmal week. his team trumpeted the symbolic victory of US-EU accession negotiations and called it a sign history is made for those who don't get tired of fighting for freedom. But for actual EU membership, the war has to end, which is absolutely true, and it has to end with Ukraine remaining a viable nation. Neither of these is guaranteed. And then, of course, like the Financial Times, we're told about how both the US Congress and the EU Council both stalled on the promises of further financial aid. The $61 billion package has not gone through Congress. The 50 billion euro package has not been approved by the EU Council. And the article does admit the bleak military picture was the case before Congress stalled US aid. Now the challenge ahead, the possibility Ukraine may face Russia without NATO backing, weighs on the minds of those who should be focused on the winter battles ahead. Without aid, we are finished, one morose Ukrainian medic told me Thursday after months of patching troops back together and losing a colleague in the summer. Other troops managed to be more stoic and insist they will fight on as they have no choice, but be in no doubt no US or EU money or just one of those failing quite likely means most of Ukraine will fall under Russian occupation in the next 2 years. And then the article goes on to say that would put a belligerent, supercharged, revenge-hungry Russian military right on NATO's borders, something which would immediately become Washington's problem. And the article laments that Zelensky faces an ally in the US so split and ignorant in part of its body politics, he must pretend things are not that bad. To admit Ukraine is struggling bolsters the argument that there is no point funding a loser. If he says that Ukraine is winning, then why does he need more help? If it is a stalemate, then surely that is not too bad after 2 years. And then the article does admit that some fringe Republicans insist Russia was always going to win, so why delay the inevitable by providing aid that gets Ukrainians killed? And the interesting thing is this article doesn't actually argue back on that point. It doesn't say that Ukraine will win if it is provided with more Western military aid. But it just goes on to do what people confronted with that question invariably do, which is to respond by saying, those who want to say no to Ukraine need little excuse, but it delays the next darker question of when do you finally say no to Moscow? How much of Ukraine, or maybe later its European neighbours, is it acceptable for Putin to subjugate or flatten? Does this question feel at all familiar? So it's 1938 all over again. We can almost hear the rattle of Neville Chamberlain's umbrella. We must go on giving money to Ukraine, even though all the money that we gave in the past has achieved, well, nothing but a prolonged and disastrous war, and the Russians are winning. Notice that nowhere in this article is there any suggestion that there should be any talks with Moscow. Anyway, I said that there were 2 articles in CNN, and the other article is in some ways even more stark. It's by Jim Sciutto, and it says, Western officials warn Ukraine is certain to fail against Russia if US doesn't provide more aid. Notice that in this occasion, it's no longer a likely probability, it becomes an absolute certainty. And interestingly enough, the article starts with a most interesting admission by a senior US military official. There is no guarantee of success with us, but they are certain to fail without us. And so, if we give money, if we give the Ukrainians all they want, well, they might still lose. Perhaps they will still lose, but there's just a chance, however small, that they might come through. Whereas, of course, if we don't give them aid, well, they'll just go and lose definitely and obviously rather more quickly. So again, that's the choice which Western political leaders, parliamentarians, members of Congress, Western electorates are being offered. Then we are also told that Western intelligence agencies are currently calculating how long Ukraine could hold out without US and NATO help. One senior US military official estimated months, and with a worst-case scenario of a significant setback or even defeat by the summer. A Russian victory would not just be dire news for Ukraine, it would be disaster for wider European security and a major blow to the US. And we go on to read that Ukrainian forces are already rationing ammunition. US and Ukrainian officials told CNN as Russian forces fire back at a ratio of 5 to 7 times greater than Ukrainian forces are able to. And without additional US aid, officials assessed that Ukraine would first run out of long-range missiles, then air defense missiles, and later artillery ammunition and short-range missiles such as shoulder-fired Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. The last two categories, as I understand it, they've already largely run out of. So I don't know where that comes from. And we're then told about what a disaster it would be if the Storm Shadows and the Scalps and the ATACMS missiles weren't still being provided. What an even bigger disaster it would be if the air defense missiles ceased to be provided. And without the anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, the Ukrainians would be unable to defend themselves against Russia's tanks and our aircraft, which greatly outnumbered them. And then again, we're told about the appalling consequences if the Russians win. I don't think people fully realize what Ukraine's fall would actually mean, said a European diplomat. We would see horrible things, ethnic cleansing and total destruction of Ukraine. Remember what they did in Bucha. So it is already success if we can prevent that from happening. And that is why we must carry on. We must carry on, apparently, even if we can't prevent it happening, because the US intelligence officer, quoted right at the outset of this article, even admitted that there is no guarantee of success, even if all the Western support promised is indeed provided, only a guarantee of failure if that support, if that aid is withheld. Well, before we move on, let's again make the further point here that this article again reduces everything to an either-or situation. Either we support Ukraine with unlimited amounts of money and give them even more weapons from the diminishing stockpiles of our own, or we suffer a catastrophic defeat. Negotiating with the Russians, again, is not something that this article even appears to consider. Looking at a situation of total failure, you say to yourself, well, what should I do? Just go on doing that very same thing, giving Ukraine money and weapons and promises of training and promises of eventual admission into the European Union and into NATO, which brought Ukraine to this disaster in the first place. And again, before I continue here, let us just take a step back and ask ourselves again how we got to this point. How we got to the point where, in the words of that first CNN article, there is supposedly a possibility that a belligerent, supercharged, revenge-hungry Russian military might find itself back on NATO's borders. How did this happen? Well, it's not difficult. It's been discussed in endless programs on this channel. It's also been discussed many times by Alex and Christoforu and us on the Duran. We've had discussions about it on the Duran with all sorts of people who have been involved in negotiations between the United States and Russia. People like Ambassador Jas Freeman, Ambassador Jack Matlock, others like this. We've had discussions, Glenn Deason and I, with academics like Nicholas Petrov, Richard Sakwa. There have been endless numbers of articles about this. Gordon Hahn has written about this brilliantly. Once upon a time, Stephen Cohen, great academic and historian as he was, he wrote about it too. Where the reason we are where we are is because of the West's utterly relentless insistence on expanding NATO eastwards, disregarding Russian security concerns and going back on promises made to the Russians at the end of the Cold War that NATO expansion would never happen. And as Putin was at pains to point out in his press conference 2 days ago, whenever this drive to bring Ukraine into NATO appeared to be thwarted, the Western powers showed no hesitation in supporting unconstitutional overthrows of elected governments in Ukraine. This happened in 2003 with the so-called Orange Revolution. It happened in 2014 with the overthrow of President Yanukovych's government. By the way, though Putin never mentions it and scarcely anybody remembers it anymore, it also essentially happened in 2007 when the Ukrainian parliament was dissolved unconstitutionally when following elections, it produced a coalition led by Viktor Yanukovych, which opposed Ukraine's membership of NATO. And again, to reiterate once more, these coups, these repeated coups or illegal seizures of power or constitutional uprisings or call them whatever you want, fervently backed by the West. There were Western politicians on Maidan Square, both in 2003 and in 2014, Victoria Nuland famously was there in 2014 handing out her cookies, but other Western politicians, including many from Europe, were there also. These illegal changes of government and this endless, relentless pressure to bring Ukraine into NATO and ultimately, and also into the EU as well, all happened even as NATO membership, at least, was a deeply unpopular prospect for the greater part of the Ukrainian public. Now, all of these unconstitutional changes of government, this systematic destabilization of Ukraine in pursuit of this objective, eventually in 2014, they led to Russian countermoves, the annexation, or as the Russians say, unification with Crimea, which, by the way, held a referendum to join Russia, and in which even Western observers admit the overwhelming majority of people want to remain a part of Russia. And of course, it led to the uprisings in the Donbas, which in turn led to an armed attack on the people who had been engaged in those uprisings by the new government, the new pro-Western government that had taken power in Kiev, which spiraled into an outright war, which led eventually in February 2015 to the Minsk agreement, which was intended to settle this conflict in Ukraine, an agreement mediated by Germany, France, and Russia, and which could have provided the pathway to a peaceful settlement of the crisis in Ukraine, but which did not do so because the Western-backed government refused to implement it, and the Western states, the United States, Britain, Germany, France, whilst pretending to support the Minsk agreement and ludicrously sanctioning Russia for Russia's supposed failure to support the Minsk agreement, nonetheless decided that they would support Ukraine, which was, of course, actually sabotaging the Minsk agreement. And all of this astonishing pattern of behavior, of increasingly provocative behavior and disregard of Russian wishes and of agreements that had been made with the Russians, all of that cumulatively led us to the position which we are in now. The position where, according to this article in CNN, Ukraine might be destroyed and the West might be faced with a belligerent, supercharged, revenge-hungry Russian military right on NATO's borders. Well, none of these articles want to acknowledge any of that. We have seen that the reason for this crisis is because of a refusal to negotiate with the Russians in good faith. Negotiations have taken place, but they have never taken place in good faith. A refusal to negotiate with the Russians in good faith. And even as both of these articles acknowledge that military defeat is now staring the West, and Ukraine, of course, in the face, and even as one intelligence officer, US intelligence officer, admits that even with continued US support, there is no guarantee that that defeat can be avoided. What do these articles suggest? Still no negotiations with the Russians in good faith. Instead, let's just have more war, more weapons, more money, more support for Ukraine, more promises to Ukraine, worthless promises, every bit as worthless as the promises and the assurances which were formally given to Russia. The only political leader in the West who has ever, I think, shown any real grasp of the true nature of the crisis in Ukraine, the enormous risks the West was taking onto itself, but who has never at any time had the moral courage to speak out against them, even though he occupied a position, the most powerful position in the West, from which, had he made the right choices, he could have made a difference. Anyway, the only politician who has expressed the underlying and actual truth was Barack Obama, who, as I remember, way back in 2016, gave an interview with The Atlantic in which he straightforwardly said that the fundamental problem the West faces in Ukraine is that in Ukraine the Russians will always have escalatory dominance. He was right then, and we are seeing that play out now. So, let's get back now to what's actually happening on the battlefields. And there's been a huge cascade of reports. It's not always easy to keep up with all of the events. I'm just going to speak briefly about the salient things that are happening. But suffice to say that there's been commentaries now on various Ukrainian channels, on Strana, on, I think it was Resident, those kind of Telegram channels. And they're all talking about a deteriorating picture, that Ukraine has burnt up its reserves, that there are no reserves left to deploy on the battlefield, that there are increasing shortages of men and ammunition and of heavy equipment, that as a result, units which ought to be withdrawn to the rear to rest and to rebuild are having to be deployed from place to place to try to fill up gaps, and that the Russians are pushing harder all the time on every part of the front lines. And of course, the two critical points remain Avdeyevka and Bakhmut. In Avdeyevka, there's been lots of reports, which some of it interesting actually, seem to be coming now from Ukrainian channels. They admit increasingly, and these are, I should say, semi-dissident Ukrainian channels, but they admit how bad the situation is becoming, that the Russians are indeed now enlarging the areas of control that they have now carved out within the Avdeyevka perimeter. As that article in CNN said, the Russians are in fact busy hiving off parts of Avdeyevka bit by bit. There is now conclusive confirmation, for example, that the Russians are fighting within the residential areas of Avdeyevka itself. There was another long piece on Slavyangrad explaining how tenuous supply routes into Avdeyevka have now become, how the Russians are able to shell vehicles that move along the 2 or 3 roads that remain open into Avdeyevka. It's important to remember again that this is a salient now. Avdeyevka is at the tip of a salient shaped a little like a sock, and the supplies have to trundle along a road which is covered on two sides by the Russians, admittedly some distance away, but still near enough, I suspect, to be able to keep track of what's going on the road, with drone surveillance and all of that, and well within range of medium-range artillery. And the Russians, as I said, have broken into the perimeter, through the perimeter, and are now fighting in the town itself against this brigade, the 110th Brigade, which must by now be running increasingly short of men and ammunition, and which is probably finding it very difficult indeed to hold its positions. But there's also been a fair amount of news that the Russians have now significantly expanded their bridgehead west of the railway. There was a report yesterday that said that Russian tanks are now operating west of the railway. About 3 weeks ago, there was an article in El País in which a Ukrainian soldier from the 47th Brigade said that it would be a disaster for the Russians for the Ukrainians if the Russians could transfer tanks across the railway and move on and take Berdichi, and that would essentially shut the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka into a trap. Well, the Russians have now started to move tanks, it seems, across the railway. About a week ago, they started to move some armoured vehicles across the railway. Apparently, the resistance was very strong, and some of those armoured vehicles were destroyed and they were pulled back. As I said, there's been a lot of to and forth in this fighting, and there's no doubt, by the way, that the Russians have taken significant losses here. But anyway, the latest reports suggest that the Russians have enlarged their bridgehead. They now occupy at least a part of Stepovoye and significant areas to the north and south of it, Stepovoye, and they've been able now to transfer tanks across the railway. Now, it's still not a breakthrough. The Ukrainians are still resisting with everything they have, but the pressure the Russians have exerted on Avdeyevka throughout the autumn, ever since they started the offensive in the Avdeyevka area, has been unrelenting, and it is increasing. And even as the Ukrainians try and pull reserves from every part of their front line to try to hold positions in Avdeyevka, I get the sense that those reserves are simply being burnt up, and the Russians, who are now almost certainly outnumbering the Ukrainians on the battlefronts, not just in Avdeyevka, but pretty much everywhere. The Russians, far better equipped, far better armed, with vast numbers of drones, they just keep on coming. And at some point, perhaps in the next couple of days or weeks or month or so, all of this is going to break, and resistance around Avdeyevka will break down. And again, and for the record, I do not understand the reason why the 110th Brigade is being kept in Avdeyevka. We've already seen the first attempt by CNN to tell us that this is a place of minimal significance, to walk back all those earlier claims about this enormous strategic importance of this town. Well, whatever it is, whether it is enormously important strategically or of minimal significance, it makes no sense to sacrifice brave men, the 110th Brigade, in this kind of way, fighting pointlessly to hold a town that is now rapidly becoming undefendable. Whether Avdeyevka is strategically important or not, humanitarian concerns and military logic, I would have thought, call for pulling back Ukrainian troops from Avdeyevka back to the Ukrainian lines, consolidating them, conserving men and machines, of which Ukraine is now disastrously short. Of course, the same is true about that bridgehead in Krynky. We've seen that the Ukrainians, even the Ukrainian troops who are there, are bewildered as to the reason why they are still there. The CNN article says that this is an enormously foolhardy, risky, ultimately pointless operation. Brave men again are being sacrificed for no discernible objective, no discernible military objective, that is. It makes far better sense, logically, to pull them out. But again, for political reasons, or perhaps I should say for public relations reasons, that is something that Ukraine apparently finds it impossible to do. General Zelensky supposedly always says that it should be done. President Zelensky says that every millimeter of Ukrainian ground must be defended. General Zelensky never takes action to countermand President Zelensky's orders. If he ever does do so, then we will know, in effect, that power is passing from Zelensky to him. And perhaps that's the moment we should now be waiting for. But anyway, that is the situation in Avdeyevka. And there are also reports that the situation in near Marinka, or in Marinka, is also moving a certain direction now. It seems that the Russians are now rapidly taking control of all of the remaining outlying areas separated from the residential district of Marinka, which they have not already captured. It seems that, to all intents and purposes, the Russians have indeed captured this long contested town. And I've heard, I think it was again on Slavyangrad, I've seen, I should say, that there's only one street left of buildings still to occupy, and that's a detached area separated from the main built-up area of Marinka itself. And we're talking about, as I understand it, some relatively small buildings. So, Marinka rapidly being cleared. The Russians have apparently now entered the village of Novo-Mikhailovka to the south of Marinka. They're also pushing in other directions from Marinka. They're gradually acting to break Ukrainian defenses and supply lines, including the ones to Vuhledar, as I've discussed in the past. And of course, if Vuhledar also falls alongside Marinka, then Ukraine will be in severe crisis indeed. And in the Bakhmut area, where, as I said, fighting has actually arguably been most intense over the course of the entire year, both at the first half of the year when the Wagner organization, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, captured Bakhmut from Ukraine, and since then, when the Ukrainians first counterattacked and were repelled by the Russians, and now since then, when the Russians have gone back on the attack and captured Khromovo and have been pushing hard in all sorts of directions. Well, again, the reports are that the Russians have now recaptured territory directly to the west of Bakhmut, the so-called dacha fields, the places where people in Bakhmut presumably had their weekend cottages. That's something you find often in towns in this part of the world, dacha settlements located around them. Anyway, apparently the area of the dachas has now been largely recaptured by the Russian military, and the Russians appear to have been pushing to the northwest of Bogdanovka village, to the northwest of Bakhmut, but one which the Russians are now in the process of assaulting. But the Russians, interestingly enough, seem to be bypassing Bogdanovka as well, and seem to be pushing ever closer towards Chasiv Yar, the main assembly point of Ukrainian forces that have been either defending Bakhmut or trying to recapture Bakhmut over the course of this year. If Chasiv Yar is captured, that brings the Russians up to a canal system. Beyond the canal is the village, is the town, small town of Konstantinovka, where, by the way, during the Battle of Bakhmut in the winter, General Syrskyi, as I remember, had his headquarters. If Konstantinovka is captured, then the way is open for the Russians to advance towards Kramatorsk. And if in the north the Russians are able to capture Liman and Kupiansk and perhaps eventually Izium, they would be strategically well placed to push on towards Slavyansk. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk between them form a key urban conurbation. If Ukraine loses control of those two towns, if it loses control of Vuhledar, as well as Marinka, Avdeyevka, and another important town, Pokrovsk, in south-central Donbas, the Donbas war will have eventually ended. The Russians, there will be nothing of significance left to stop a further Russian advance towards the Dnieper. And as I've said already, in my opinion, if the Russians do reach the Dnieper, say around close to the big Ukrainian city of Dnipro, then at that point, Ukraine is in such severe crisis that we would be definitely looking at the imminent end of the war. But I'm going to discuss that in more detail somewhere else. Anyway, there were more reports yesterday of more Russian airstrikes and missile strikes up and down and across Ukraine. There is a report that there was a very big Russian missile strike on an airbase in Khmelnytsky. Some suggestions that this strike was undertaken using hypersonic Kinjal missiles. There's rumours, and I want to stress again at the moment, these are only rumours, that large numbers of senior Ukrainian officers and some NATO officers were killed in this missile strike. There's been no word of confirmation about this yet from any source. We'll just have to wait and see whether any news of this kind, either confirming or refuting this claim, now appears. And Ukraine itself, it should be said, went forward and launched an enormous drone strike against Crimea yesterday. But the Russians claimed that they were able to bring all the drones down, they were able to detect them and shoot them down. Again, some people are skeptical about these claims. On balance, I'm not. I think that when drones and missiles do get through to Crimea, through the very dense and sophisticated Russian air defense system, we tend to find rapid confirmation. And there's been no confirmation of that up to now. So anyway, that is the overall situation. Some Ukrainian channels are now coming forward and are saying that the situation is now becoming so bad that at some point next year, perhaps in the summer, the Ukrainian military will be left with little option but to withdraw for its own defense into the cities, into places like Kharkiv, Dnipro perhaps, Zaporozhye, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, those places, ceding most of the countryside around the cities to Russian control. It would become a war of Ukrainian infantry retreating into sort of fortress cities, trying to hold back the much more powerful mechanized Russian military advancing westwards. Now, people who know much more about military history than me will know that somebody else tried something rather like that in the last stages of a war that he initiated, and that was the German leader at the end of the Second World War. He too, as he began to run out of men and machines in his long war against the Soviet Union, began to declare various German towns, fortresses, and withdraw German units into those towns, and called on them to resist the oncoming tide of the Red Army. And in some places, these troops did put up a spirited fight for themselves and were indeed able to hold the Russians back for quite a few weeks or months. There was a long, protracted battle for Königsberg, for example, and I believe Breslau as well. Others who know more about the history of the Second World War will be able to elaborate on this in more detail than I can do. Suffice to say that the strategy didn't ultimately work. The Russians still got through to Berlin, and I can't see how it can work now. Troops who are withdrawn into city fortresses still need to be supplied, if not with food and water, which presumably the Russians would not want to interrupt. They would not want to be accused of presiding over a Gaza-like catastrophe in Ukraine. But the troops would still need to be kept supplied with weapons and ammunition. The one thing that's become absolutely clear to me, reading and following the facts of this war, is how quickly equipment, ammunition, gets burnt up in this sort of fighting. Anyway, presumably the troops in these fortresses would need those supplies. If the Russians control all the roads into the cities, which presumably is what withdrawing from the countryside would amount to, then how can a prolonged, indefinite defense of these cities be achieved? And given how demoralizing for Ukraine taking such a step would be, and given the growing tensions within Ukrainian society, I wonder how practical an option this really is. I have to say also that if the Ukrainian General Staff and or the Ukrainian government are really thinking along these lines, then it is a disaster, it is a further disaster that they seem to be intent on visiting upon Ukraine, on top of all of the other disasters which we have just seen. It would mean sacrificing or placing in jeopardy Ukraine's cities. It would be effectively holding large civilian populations hostage. It would potentially escalate the destruction to astonishing levels, and it would be probably, if done in a certain way, it would probably be a war crime in itself. Just saying. So, I don't see myself that there is any military way out in this war. And I've already discussed in many programs that negotiations are the only way, the only sensible way for the debacle that we are hearing about, the debacle which might result in that belligerent, supercharged, revenge-hungry Russian military reaching NATO's borders. I want to stress, by the way, that if the Russian army does reach NATO's borders, it would be no more than, in some ways, a historic balancing of accounts. What has NATO been doing, if not trying to push Western armies, NATO armies, to Russian borders? What else was NATO expansion about than that? And why assume that what would indeed be a very powerful Russian army, indeed in that case, why assume that it would be belligerent and revenge-hungry? Doesn't the word revenge-hungry in itself, by the way, give the game away? Doesn't it suggest that the Russians have something to feel vengeful about? Fortunately, and I say this with some experience of Russians, they don't strike me as a very vengeance-minded people, but that's another thing. But anyway, if one believes that we are risking these catastrophic outcomes, given that we've just been told how uncertain the outcome would be, even if we continue to supply Ukraine with Western supplies, and given the remorseless growth of the Russian military, Putin has said that there's now 600,000 Russian troops operating within the area of the special military operation. Not all of them are fighting by any means. Some people, Simplicius the thinker, continue to think that some of these troops are being held back to reconstitute new divisions and new brigades which will not be committed to the fighting. I disagree, by the way. All of those men who have been called up, who've joined the military this year, over the course of this year, obviously partly they've done that because of the very attractive financial terms that they are being offered, but certainly most of them, the great majority of them, are also joining up from a sense of patriotism and from a conviction that Russia is engaged in what they believe is a just war, and they will presumably be angry and disappointed, and perhaps in some cases feel betrayed, if they are not committed to fighting in it. So I think that the overwhelming probability, contrary to what people like Simplicius the thinker may think, is that most of these troops will indeed be engaged at various times in the special military operation, though not, of course, all of them at the same time. The Russians will always keep troops in reserve and will always rotate troops in order to keep them fresh. So just saying all of this. But anyway, given the trajectory of events, surely the thing to do, if you really want to avoid these catastrophic consequences that we've now been hearing about, catastrophic consequences which in much more measured language I have been warning about for the better part of 2 years, as we have been doing on the Duran. Well, surely the right thing to do is to open negotiations with the Russians. Now, interestingly enough, Sergei Lavrov has talked about this. He said that the Russians have indeed received some overtures from some people in the West. He says that one Western leader in particular has, on 3 occasions, indicated that he would like to establish some kind of contact. Lavrov was not careful not to name this leader, but I think most people would guess that it's Emmanuel Macron. But of course, as Lavrov pointed out, any overtures that the Russians do get have to address Russia's long-standing security interests, which include the security architecture of Europe. And Macron has never shown, up to this time, any serious willingness to do that. Nor, of course, has any other Western leader. And Lavrov was pretty open about his deep skepticism of all the overtures that have been made. And in fact, I've heard that at the recent conference that took place in Moscow, the one which was attended by people like Larry Johnson and Alistair Crook, which both Larry Johnson and Alistair Crook had discussed in different programs for the Duran. I've heard that some Russian officials there actually said that there's no real communications between the Russians and the Western powers underway at the moment. And to the extent that the Russians have received people who might be described as emissaries, firstly, these people have not come forward with any real plans. And since they are informal emissaries anyway, the Russians have deep doubts about how authorized they are, how much authority these people really have to conduct any type of negotiations. It's not difficult, by the way, to work out that these informal emissaries are Richard Haas and his little group from the Council for Foreign Relations, the people who've been providing us with all these interesting articles that have been appearing in Foreign Affairs and reports from the RAND Corporation and snippets of information in an article that appeared some months ago in Moscow Times. Anyway, all of these people, they have indeed been in touch with the Russians, but the Russians won't take them seriously and don't feel that they can do so. The key point to make is that when it comes to Ukraine, the prospects of a settlement that would have preserved a truly sovereign, viable, independent Ukraine was thrown away once and for all, in my opinion, when the Western powers sabotaged the Istanbul Agreement last year. But something might still be saved if the Western powers were prepared to discuss the general security situation in Europe. George Beebe, in that article which I talked about yesterday, or was it the day before yesterday, has hinted that that is what the West should do. It's a relief to see that at least somebody gets it. But I have to say, I see no sign of anyone else doing so. And in light of this, it seems to me that we are now inexorably, remorselessly moving to precisely that outcome, that entirely avoidable outcome, that outcome which should never have been brought about, the outcome where we do indeed have a belligerent, well, perhaps not a belligerent, but certainly a supercharged Russian military right on NATO's borders. Now, there is some degree of, there is growing awareness of this, and by the way, some elements of panic. At least in Europe, there's an article, for example, in the Daily Telegraph by the former British diplomat, Sir Ivor Roberts. He says that there's now growing fears about growing isolationism in the United States. It's interesting how the Europeans, whenever they sense that the Americans might be thinking about talking peace with the Russians, talk about, raise again the spectre of pre-World War II isolationism. But anyway, he talks about how, Europe may have to do without the United States. It should start thinking about a future of an unending confrontation, apparently, with Russia without the United States. And even the recent steps of the Biden administration apparently point increasingly in that direction, as do the recent events in Congress. Now, I'm going to say something here. Firstly, I think that any idea that Europe by itself can wage a Cold War against Russia is not only absurd without America, is not only absurd, it is straightforwardly dangerous. One of the major problems about NATO and about the whole US, EU, NATO, Euro-Atlantic alliance system that emerged after the Second World War is that the European states, hiding behind American protection, have never had to face the need of sorting out their long-term relations with the single most powerful European country by far, which is Russia. Russia emerged as Europe's most powerful country after the Second World War. But Europeans, because they were able to get the Americans to involve themselves in European affairs, never had to face up to the implications of that. They could always pretend that the Russians were some dark other and tell themselves stories about the Russian barbarians there in the east and avoid having to get to know the Russians and to reach long-term understandings with them because, well, there was always the United States to keep those Russian barbarians at a distance. And I think fundamentally, that is why we are in this situation now, why Europe is facing this situation, because Europe has never used those long years of American protection to come itself to a long-term sustainable resolution of the various conflicts left over from the Second World War and even beyond with the Russians. The time to do that now is desperately short. But at least a start could be made. I've discussed how American officials, it would be massively in American interests to come to some kind of an understanding with the Russians about the security situation in Europe. I think that rather than be afraid of this, the Europeans ought to welcome it. They should follow the lead of their three of their most eminent post-war leaders, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Willy Brandt of Germany, all of whom, in their different ways, sought, after the end of the Second World War, a long-term resolution of Europe's conflicts with Russia. In the case of Charles de Gaulle and Willy Brandt, that is well known. In the case of Winston Churchill, less so. He still gets thought of in many places as an incorrigible Cold War warrior. People are not aware, in my experience, that in his last term as Prime Minister in the early 1950s, he was overwhelmingly focused on coming to some kind of terms with the Russians in order to bring the Cold War to an end. It's high time the Europeans started to do that. But of course, with the political leaders we have in Europe today, well, one can't imagine Baerbock and Ursula and people like that, or Habeck or Scholz or Meloni, or indeed even Macron, doing that with any seriousness. Anyway, they may have to before long, given the trend of events. But for the moment, it's interesting to see that more and more people in the West are starting to realize that defeat is coming in Ukraine. Though, like the rabbit caught in the headlights of the car, they remain frozen in place, unable to think or do anything constructive about it. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program. More from me soon. To remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X. You can find us on, you can also support us via Subscribe and Patreon, links under this video. You can also go to our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. And remember, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.